Blog Talk Radio. Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May. I am joined today by Michael Buzzy.
Hello, everyone.
Randy Olson.
Hello, hello.
And we have special guest Keyvn Settle, who is a documentary filmmaker and has most recently made this amazing film called Fruits of Peace. Welcome, Keyvn.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure, it's our honor. And this show is beginning a series of shows. We sometimes do this, devote several shows to a topic that requires an extended conversation. And the topic that we begin today is such a topic. And if you're listening to this show, you may know that last Friday, which was September 18th, was National POW MIA Recognition Day. If you're not familiar with POW MIA, maybe you have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's Prisoners of War Missing in Action. And there is a National Day of Recognition in the United States. Here at Central Michigan University, we raised the POW MIA flag in front of the main administration building called Warner Hall, and that kicked off this series of podcasts and other educational activities to begin this duty to remember and really building something called a community of memory, which we'll talk about later. So that is the focus of the series, and we'll probably have two more podcasts on this theme of the duty to remember and how it relates to the issues of the prisoners of war missing in action, and as we will discuss today, their families. Their families are typically left out of at least the average person's understanding of POW MIA. I did not know this until I read this wonderful book called You Are Not Forgotten by Evelyn Grubb and Carol Joes. The link to that book is on our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. So to introduce the show, the show is called The Duty to Remember, Considering Prisoners of War and the Missing in Action as a Case Study in the Ethics of Memory. There's a lot going on in that title, and we're going to spend a few minutes just unpacking this concept of the duty to remember. And to begin that conversation, because we on this show have talked about this duty to remember, and we have connected that duty with what we call positive history, which is not necessarily the history of wars and atrocities, crimes against humanity and so forth, but positive history is more like I sometimes refer to it as peace history, or stories of cooperation and uplift is one way to understand it. So the story behind the First Geneva Convention of 1864, Henry Dunant and so forth, would be an example of positive history and how people came together to create that norm that we now know as a piece of international law, the First Geneva Convention. So to begin just unpacking this concept of the duty to remember, Randy, could you just talk about just sort of the 101 or general understanding of the duty to remember?
Sure. So the first thing that we have to dig into is a little bit about what memory might be for and what it might be about. And there's a number of relevant things that need to be parsed out. In this case, first of all, are we dealing with an individual? Are we dealing with collective memory? And what scale are we going to talk about that on? And personally, I want to kind of emphasize this individual layer, because when we talk about duties and we talk about memory, thinking about it from the vantage point of a single person ends up being the easiest way to wrap my head around anyway.
Mm.
And so the question that I've sort of circled this around is, what happens to memories that we don't understand? At the individual level, there's three tracks. Either a person is haunted or traumatized by something, or they forget or bury it or try to hide from it, or they assimilate it into themselves in such a way as to make it part of them, right? They understand it and it becomes something that forms their blocks of understanding. So I think that there's something really useful to think about there. So what happens to memories that we don't understand? Well, there's only a limited number of things. And when we know something, let's assume we've taken this third road for now, we start to use that information to build structures on top of it, right? So this is, bordering into a theory of education, but I have to get there in order to make a functional theory of memory. So really quick detour. When an individual learns something new, a whole neurological structure is built within them. It's like a database or like a skyscraper, basically, inside their head. And that new structure is this foundation piece whereupon significantly more complex things can be built up. But it has to have a foundation stone. And this is clear when we think about other things like mathematics, or we start teaching children numbers, and then once there's numbers, then you can add and subtract them, and then you can do more complex operations. And it turns out that historical knowledge has a scaffolded structure like this too. So when we learn about certain historical events, we have the foundational prerequisite for certain kinds of world historical understanding. And the connection to the past is with us right now on top of these structures that are built by us throughout our entire lives, our entire education. We get all this information and it gets stacked up on top of other things that we know. And it's with us right now. I think we can explain it really, really easily. It's like, look around. Like, I know I'm sitting on a chair. Somebody else built it, right? Well, that happened but it's here now. And, our entire civilization is sitting on top of effectively a chair that someone in the past built. And if we want to learn how to make new chairs, or at least be good stewards of the ones we're in now, we have to have information about what they're made of and how they were built. That actually becomes necessary. So the piece through law tradition, the positive history as we call it, it provides one possible foundation stone upon which, there's these support beams in some sense that encourage the secular development of a feeling of reverence that gets sort of packaged into a person's personality and packaged into their character. And it gives this big, wide base. So, okay, we now have some information about what happened. Here's a story of someone inspiring. Here's what we can now do with it. And that's where we get into this duty idea. Because we have a duty to remember certain things. And, we could talk about what a duty is and what it is not, but the short and dirty answer that, I feel like everybody has a basic idea. It's like, there's something you need to do. And the whole study of ethics is trying to determine what it is that you're supposed to do. And so we're operating today from this idea that there are some things that need to be taken seriously. They need to be remembered. They form the bedrock of our entire civilization in some cases. And so I think that we can build from there.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned reverence, and you mentioned scaffolding. And once again, I want to remind us of this other expression that we have used, which is the dignity of continuity. That, as you say, the chair that you're sitting on is like the structure, the structure of society that we have inherited. And to understand that, there's some kind of dignity, and that seems to relate to the notion of duty as well, that there's some sort of obligation for us to know about the past and to do the work of bringing that to our consciousness. And I think introducing the idea of reverence is very interesting. I will just leave it at that and see if anybody else has anything to add to this conversation or any questions, Michael or Kevin.
I really appreciate Randy laying that out. I know it helps me sort of conceptualize better this duty to remember. I really love that chair analogy as well. I also think, coming to appreciate and you have this idea of reverence for, I guess, what you've inherited and what you currently sit on and gaining a deep understanding for that will then allow you to act in such a way where you can build a chair for the generation or the society that will come after yours. So it's sort of a recognition to the past and a reverence for that and sort of internalizing that and making it so that you are then able to do the positive work for what is to come after your time here has ended.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kevin, do you want to?
Well, in the context of our work on Fruits of Peace, right? So in my lane, when we're talking about missing in action, which Nuke Grub initially was classified missing in action. There's always a chair there in terms of whether you're a veteran or you're a family member, someone who's active duty, right? So the reverence is always there. But to continue this duty to remember theme, we got to span the audiences, right? We got to reach new audiences for it really to go into the next generation and the generation thereafter. And how does that happen? That's what I find myself trying to answer a lot, because as in the case of the Shalemba remains being returned to Arlington or being buried in Arlington next year, the Michigan Army from the Korean War, much of what's going to happen here in the coming decades is as the phone calls arrive and the knocks on the doors come about additional remains being identified and brought home, there won't be any remembrance, because there'll be the grandchildren who may or may not have heard of their grandfather's story or what have you. And so, how does the scaffolding, right? How does it continue in this subject? I'm very interested in, because I've spent a lot of time with the population of those family members who have missing, and it's still very much on the surface. I've gone to the League of Families annual convention meetings a couple times since I've been on this 10-year project, and I was really taken by how much on the surface it really is. And then, of course, my work with the Grubb family, the sons of Nuke and Evelyn, and how it is just right there. And, of course, they're going to remember. And, of course, veteran families and military families are going to remember. But how do we expand and reach different people with some of these subjects that are important? So.
Yeah, and I just want to say, you've mentioned Nuke Grubb and Private First Class Shalemba, and if you're unfamiliar with those individuals, if you go to our show or our webpage, dutytoremember.com, some more is explained about both Nuke Grubb, whose wife I mentioned, Evelyn Grubb, is one of the co-authors of You Are Not Forgotten, and Private First Class John Shalemba fought in the Korean War. He was from Michigan, and his remains were identified about a year ago this time, so in September 2019, and we've sort of taken on that idea as a personal project. And this question of how do we keep scaffolding and building. I'll just take that question to very most generally introduce us to the work of philosopher Avishai Margalit in his book, The Ethics of Memory, which is linked on our show resources page, at least the Amazon page for it. So in this book, Professor Margalit makes a lot of distinctions. His original training was in analytic philosophy, and he came to discussions of political and ethical philosophy, as he says, later in life. But one of the concepts that he uses in the book, and I think that we are talking about here, that Kevin, your question of how do we widen the circle, he uses this phrase, Professor Margalit uses this phrase, community of memory. Community of memory. And how is that built? And to understand what he means by that, like I said, he's an analytic philosopher, so he's making a lot of conceptual distinctions. And one of the important distinctions that he makes is between what he calls thick relations versus thin relations, thick versus thin. And that distinction is related to another distinction, which he calls ethics and morality. And ethics would be connected to thick relations, and morality related to thin relations. And so the book is called The Ethics of Memory, not the morality of memory. So that's significant in itself. And so the thick relations are really driven by what he calls a duty of care. So, Randy, you mentioned reverence. So I'm going to introduce another value, which you're going to find discussed in Margalit's book and connected to the ethics of memory, which is caring. And he says that when you have these thick relations, so this is like family, beloveds, we have like this heightened duty of care to these certain significant others. And our duties to those persons with whom we have thick relations are different than, as he says, humanity at large. So, yes, we do have like duties to humanity at large, and now we're typically talking about things like dignity and respect, not so much caring. It's interesting to get into the conceptual distinctions, but I think that this is a really useful way to understand, the work that you have been doing, Kevin, and you said for 10 years now, which is this deep dive into this story, which that's why we're doing several shows on this, about the duty to remember POW and MIA. And as I understand it, and Kevin, you're the expert on this, so you can correct me, this duty to remember, as it is recognized by the United States, really begins with a very thick relation between the wives of the missing and the POW. So there's this, and they're caring for their husbands, and so we have this kernel or this seed that begins to grow and then reach the United States government. And so I guess I'll just open it up first, Kevin.
Yeah,
and
maybe, so I could take that. So certainly the wives, and they were mostly wives and mothers, because then most of the pilots were men. All the pilots were men, for that matter. But when we talk about POW/MIA families, it was mostly the wives, and then certainly there were brothers and sisters and mothers, but I think it's commonly referred to as the wives. So the thick relations, right, obviously with their missing or imprisoned loved one. But the thin relations maybe challenge I would think, in the upstart of the league, and this is my own words, maybe challenging the morality, if you will, of the lack of information and the lack of organization initially in the early years of the issue. The issue being there were imprisoned pilots, imprisoned service members, and missing. And there's very little information about that. And I think they challenged even, and I know in Evelyn Grubb's case, our own government. I don't want to say challenge the ultimate morality, but maybe question the morality, because the differences between right and wrong and good and bad, in that there was just so little information. And in a very large regard, I believe the league and Evelyn, they took action to change that. The change state being, no, we're going to force this issue into the light. We're going to advocate on behalf of our loved ones for more information, not only from our own government, but obviously from the DRV, from the Vietnamese government. And I think that really is, and put it in context. No social media. Maybe the post office cork board was the equivalent. Telephones, okay, but not everybody was on the phone as much then, even. And so for all these, mostly Navy pilot wives and Air Force pilot wives throughout the country, usually around the bases, where the air bases and the Air Force bases are, just banded together to challenge the thin relations here. And I think they did a really good job. And obviously, not only for the specific objective, which is bring my loved one home or find my loved one, but they did a lot of work, a ton of work on the legislative front in getting new law passed about veterans' families, the families of the deceased from war. And Evelyn talked about it in her book a little bit, but I've read in other texts, there were a lot of families going on welfare. There were mothers of 2 and 3, 4 children. They couldn't afford to eat because the husband/pilot's salary was being held up because of paperwork. There just wasn't, he just wasn't around to make the usual disbursements monthly, so the wife could run the household. So that all was changed by the league.
Yeah, thanks for that. Randy, do you have any follow-up questions or comments?
Yeah, I wanna move into the question that Kevin brought up, which is, how do we get the scope of people who care to increase? I'm paraphrasing that, but it's like, okay, so if we don't have a thick bond in between you and perhaps one of these people who is missing, why, how can we get people in that situation to start to care? And this has been an ongoing question for us for many years, and one of the things we've been operating from, and I think in a non-trivial way, is through using these physical items in order to capture attention. And so flags are kind of the main one that captures people's eyesight, at least, and their attention, at least for a moment, and it makes people ask, what if, or what's that, rather, what is that? And I know, my first time ever seeing the POW MIA flag was in the nation's capital, and in the Capitol building, it was hanging there. And I was like, what is that? I had no idea. And so there's something about these physical symbols, which they carry meaning, and they carry a message much more effectively than we tend to give them credit for. And I don't know all that much about the flag, but I know that when I saw it, I wanted to understand why is this in our nation's Capitol building? Why?
Mm-hmm. And the flag does come from the National League of Families, and I'm going to play a clip. It's about 1 minute and 24 seconds long. It is from Keyvn's film, Fruits of Peace, that I've mentioned, and we do hope to have further conversations about his film, which includes the story about the flag as well as some other incredible stories. So this is about 1 minute long, and then we're going to come back to this story about how do we build a community of memory.
And they got it so that they could fly it with the Stars and Stripes. They made a banner, and that's what she presented to Lear.
About a month ago, a symbol was adopted by the League of Families. It originated in Florida, and it was passed by the board. And we would like to present you with one of the first banners. These banners have been presented to governors, to mayors, to interested people around the country, to be used first for the week of concern of American prisoners of war and missing in action, and to be used until the men come home or are accounted for.
Newt Heisley, who designed the flag, he was a pilot in World War II, and he said, I would look down in the sea and see all the guys that were there and then killed on the island. And I thought about, what if I went down in the sea and nobody found me, and I would not want to be forgotten. And that's when he put up as the emblem of that flag. Evie loved that, and that became the motto of the League of Families.
To be a reminder of not only to our civilian personnel here in the Pentagon building, but also to our military personnel of our concern for the prisoners of war and for those missing in action in Southeast Asia.
Right, so that is the clip. And again, that's from Keyvn's film, Fruits of Peace. So,
And
yeah, the flag. Go ahead.
Well, if I could add, so I hope you started the today's podcast with recognizing September 18th this year being Day of Remembrance for POW MIAs, and so the first of such was actually signed by President Nixon as a presidential proclamation, which was March 26th through April 1st of 72. And it was during that time period when the flag also was presented, which the part of the clip that you just played was Evelyn Grubb and a handful of other League members at the Pentagon presenting one of the versions, the initial versions of the flag to Defense Secretary Melvin Laird. I'll add that the flag was being presented that week and several weeks thereafter around the nation to governors and mayors, and in order to, this community of memory, to get their symbol out, to get their message out. And it's important to come back to the comment about the flag and who created it and what it means. I think I grew up for decades thinking it was just another government flag, thinking it was, just like when we see our service component flags of the Marine Corps or Navy, what have you. That flag was in the mix for me. And in fact, it's not a government flag. It was a flag created for the sole purpose of spreading the message, getting the message out, and the wives, the POWMIA wives in the League, getting out and doing the grassroots effort so that we can galvanize people at the community level to get behind their issues.
Yeah, and at least for my part, I can say, message received. I have, of course, had seen the flag, but I was compelled to learn more about the flag, and that's what led me to the book by Evelyn Grubb and Carol Joes. And I was just amazed that women were behind this flag. and that they, as you say, were putting pressure on our own government to and I'll say, build a community of memory. This coming back to this expression again, and you see this, as Randy said in the beginning, you start with like this individual memory, which you then can build upon. And so, in the case of these women, their memory is primarily of their husbands and their lack of information, and they find each other. Like these women are able to find each other and build this league, and they start building this community of memory amongst themselves that then reaches our own government, and now through the flag, through people, to civilians, to students. And so to speak about that aspect of it, I'll ask Michael Buzzy to perhaps make a comment, because Michael has been working on this as a student and was there when we raised the flag here last Friday. It's the first time we've ever raised the flag, or the first time we've ever commemorated POW MIA Recognition Day, and we have a new head of the cadre of the ROTC unit, Lieutenant Colonel John Bacon, and he said in his 20 years of service he had never been to a POW MIA Recognition Day. So it was a really special day, and since Michael, you're a student, you're like not a typical member in this community of memory that you do have with the families, and eventually we'll talk about the governmental agency that they work with. But can you just say a little bit about the community of memory and widening it to include students and younger generation, et cetera?
Yeah, of course. I really appreciate you, Mr. Settle, stating that you had always seen the POW MIA flag as a government flag, because I don't think until having heard that from you a couple minutes ago, that was my entire conception of it as well. I had seen the flag throughout my entire life growing up, my whole 19 years. I mean, not an extremely long amount of time, but it was always placed like at government, just like sort of state government-run facilities. So like the local library or courthouses, or that was my first introduction to it. And I had thought, just like any other government banner, that was something that the United States government had done. And I had really never thought twice about it, that, oh, that's so cool that they're deciding to, recognize and support these individuals. And so that was years ago. And then truly only over the course of this past month and a half have I really come to totally widen my conception as to how truly profound this whole cause is, and how individualistic it is too, and how deep-seated it is in individuals' passion to just have their family members recognized and remembered, and to be accounted for when they have gone missing. And so to know that this flag has come from the wives and a cause started and championed by women was another extremely profound thing for me to come to learn. And so that component of it, and that through all of their toiling and their hard work, that they were able to, like Randy said, get it placed in the Capitol, and for it to be such a widely distributed symbol. But I think for me personally, and my view on it, for I guess my peers, that a huge part of it for me was the education. That I had never been instructed in this history. I sadly had never known who Evelyn Grubb was, or that whole facet of it, until working with Hope on this whole project. And I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to learn this. And truly, it is a history that I feel has embedded itself within me. And it is something through, working on the distribution of material through Facebook and communications with Hope and other organizations on campus that helped to bring the Missing Man table into Warner Hall and the flag raising out on the mall in front of the building, that I truly came to understand this history. And it was through sort of my own organization as well. I think when I first started to learn about this, it was all very scattered, the different components of, okay, there's this flag, and then there's this Evelyn Grubb individual, and then somehow, like almost half a century later, an individual from Vietnam comes to the United States looking for nuke rum in some capacity. And so I started off in chaos, and then through the work of, like, the personal work myself, and through communications with others who know this history, and for you, Mr. Settle, coming to learn about your work, and that all really helped to, you know, organize it and find the commonality that connects all of these different events together. And then you truly can see that, yeah, the culmination of it is this Ignition Day and the flag and the work that is still put in now for remembrance. So I think a big component for individuals my age would be, you know, coming to know this history that most people, I think, have seen the flag, but that, you know, desire within yourself to know, that passion and drive to question and sort of enter the forest, as Hope would say, of this cause just through the flag, if that's your first, you know, visual representation of the POW MIA cause. And once you dig into it, it touched, I would hope it would touch them in the same amazingly profound way it has impacted me.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was, I mean, hearing your passion and energy through the call line here is phenomenal for me. I definitely, if anything, have created an advocate for the cause that was not of my own, but created by the League. And I'm sure that you'll be carrying the torch for years to come on their behalf. And I look forward to learning more about you and the work that you guys are doing at Central Michigan University around the series of events here to come. So it's a very, again, your energy and passion is very welcomed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate hearing that.
So I'd like to jump in here because I find myself in an interesting position where I'm personally kind of split about halfway in between the distinction we described, which is thick and thin bonds. And, you know, I grew up in a family where both sides, both grandparents were World War II veterans. And so I have, you know, some idea of the degree to which my lifestyle is a product of their service. But when the time came when I turned 18, you know, my parents, you know, shooed the recruiter away from the door. And so there's been this, like, civilian life with a military upbringing combo that I've had this weird experience with. And when I hear stories like the one we're talking about today, when I hear about any kind of work that women have done throughout the last 100 years that's related to military activity in any way, I'm constantly brought back to the same place, which is the recognition that there's a relationship between what's happening on the other side of the planet and what's happening inside my own heart, what's happening inside my own community. It's like these things aren't actually separated, and every time there's a symbol like this, it reminds me. And, you know, I come back to this idea about physical, tangible things because I'm, you know, the kind of person that's trapped in the physical world almost all of the time. And, you know, I have a watch, right, that reminds me of my grandfather. And that's one of the things I use to remind myself about these things. But, you know, for people who didn't grow up in a family that has military service on one or either side, there aren't, like, family heirlooms to ground the relationship between the individual and the international community built into their, you know, their upbringing. And so I find myself in, like, a profound state of awe to the people who organize these things and recognize the power of these symbols to start to bring that level of awareness that the individual has these responsibilities to the international community and bring that into other people's lives. Because, frankly, there's no better thing to weave together a person's historical identity than that, recognition of the relationship between the individual and the international community. I mean, there's nothing more important, as far as I know, than, grounding yourself in that. And the symbols are a great way to do it. And, some people don't have any, so here's one. And it's really, it's a pretty clear symbol identifying a cause that pretty much everyone can get behind. And I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating there, so overstepping or something, but I feel like I don't know anyone who wouldn't be willing to support a cause for POWs and people like I don't know anyone who's like, yeah, you know what, that's not something I support.
Right, and
well,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add that there are a lot of organizations that are both private and, of course, federal government organizations that work to still bring closure for the families, right, to try to find the missing and, as in Nuke Grubb's case, get his remains home. There's still a large number of missing from the Vietnam conflict, as well as conflicts before that, in the upwards of 80,000 still from World War II. So it's difficult work, and I think and a lot of these organizations, the private ones, have been operating for decades. However, now with the ability to get video media and rich media out more quickly and from the field and under the water, for instance, as well, and social media, we're learning more and more about these organizations. And, I think when I look at, and I've researched some of them, when I look at the composition of the leadership and the people on staff, it isn't just, there aren't just members or prior service members. There are just people where this subject, where the idea of bringing closure for a family or the sacred promise of bringing, a missing home is important for that person, for that person's community, intrinsically inside of himself to do that duty. And I think in a way, in one of the organizations that website is Keeping America's Promise. And in my work with the film, I really had to put a wide lens on this subject. I spoke with a lot of former POWs in Vietnam, as well as family members of former MIAs, as well as current MIAs. And, the resonating net from all of that conversation is that when the service member puts on the uniform or enlists and signs and says, I'm going to go into duty, they know they may make that ultimate sacrifice. But I think, again, the net from my conversations across that spectrum of people is that, shall I fall, please bring my body home for my family. Don't let my family suffer. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And again, a resonating pattern for my work in speaking with these families. So,
anyone want to follow up? So, I take that as a no right now. But Kevin, you mentioned both the private and the governmental organizations that are involved, and so I'm going to ask you to talk about the governmental one, the POW MIA Accounting Agency, also called the DPAA. But when we're talking about a duty to remember, this duty of memory. Randy, you were talking about this international connection. And at least with the POW MIA case, of course it's international because we're talking about international conflict, but in terms of building the community of memory, so much work has to be done with the United States because, as we're saying, there's just a lot of ignorance about the families behind this movement to help create a community of memory in the first place nationally. And so part of the duty to remember is this, as you said also before, Randy, like you have to do some work. There's things that you have to do. And so to implement this duty, there are organizations in place. And Kevin, could you talk about the DPAA, a little bit of its history and what it does and the execution nationally of this duty?
I'll speak about the DPAA and its predecessor, JPAC, as I know it. Again, within my lane, the present-day version of organizations that were established as part of the Paris Peace Accord led us to these organizations, JPAC and then now DPAA. But DPAA is a DoD agency, as you introduced. I'm certainly not an expert on everything about them, and the families of MIAs work with them regularly because they get the family updates and they get information about their cases. But they're in the somewhere 500, 550 people that are across the globe, mostly in the South Pacific and Asia, as well as Europe, because of the two large wars where most of MIAs still exist. Initially it's casework 101. You get information, a lead, there's casework, just as if it was any other investigative casework, say for DOJ or the local police for that matter. And then information is maturated, curated, and then ultimately might be a site location involved, and then they survey the site and they work with the governments depending on where that case is. Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. In Europe, of course, it's a lot easier. And depending, then obviously it's kind of like the pharmaceutical industry. You have a lot more leads or a lot more targets for drugs than you have people to go out and work them, whether it's driven by money or resources, time, or cooperation by the foreign governments, obviously. And so they do that work, but really getting it back to my lane, because I could probably talk about this for a long time, and I'm not really, to have that much work with DPAA, but in my work for Fruits of Peace, because Nuke Grubb did die in captivity, purportedly. And so there was the issue of Nuke Grubb's remains coming home, being repatriated. Ultimately, they were. And we cover this in the film. But there was the Paris Peace Accord of January 73, right? The end of the war. And everybody says, okay, well, that means you just stop fighting. Right. Cessation of hostilities is part of it. But what the Peace Accord really established was, how then are we going to move forward in articles? Articles for, say, base closures. Articles for, okay, we need a commission for prisoner exchange. Okay. Articles for, well, how are we going to do grave and mortuary services so bodies and remains can be exchanged, et cetera, et cetera. All that is in the Peace Accord. But, again, back to Nuke Grubb's case. And in his case, because he was imprisoned in Hanoi, purportedly, there were 23 American former POWs, DIC, died in captivity, that didn't come home in February and March of 73. They were buried in various sites around Hanoi and then moved to one common site. Actually, it was two and then one eventually. But what was established back to the Geneva Peace Accords was this group called the Four-Party Joint Military Commission and then the team. So FPJMT, and I did a lot of research on this group because there's a ton of work. They did a ton of work and they had a ton of film, photography, and text records, not only in the National Archives, but the Vietnam Center at Texas Tech online there, but in person physically at the National Archives. But they were in an article of the the Paris Peace Accord. If I keep saying Geneva because that's the first one of Vietnam, but the Paris Peace Accord. And so it was their duty to work together. And when I say work together, so it was a four-party. It was the four main belligerents of that war. So it was the DRV, the North, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the PRG, which everybody calls the Viet Cong, is the provisional government of the Republic of South Vietnam. Then there's the Republic of Vietnam, and then there's the United States. Those are the four-party members. All 2 and 2 versus one another now have to work together on prisoner exchange and exchanging the remains of those from burial sites. And they did work well, kind of, for a while. I've read a lot of their reports and monthly, weekly reports. But it did get tense for a while. Americans were killed. There still was hostilities toward this group because, for whatever reason, it was more about getting information out that the war had ended and that you need to cease hostilities. But helicopters were shot down. Americans died as well, South Vietnamese. And it ultimately led to a huge PSYOPs operation to awareness campaign, actually, of leaflets and posters to generate leads about American remains, in village XYZ or on this mountainside or in this river or in this rice paddy. And that was a big part of their effort working with the Army PSYOPs because at some point operations were limited because of the fear of risk of life. But back to Nuke Grub. So FPJMT, along with another group called the Joint Casualty Resolution Center, worked to not only visit and identify the remains in Hanoi it was March, April, May of 73. But it was almost a full year in March of 74 until they were allowed to exhume and repatriate those remains. But they had visited that site in April, May of 73. And Nuke Grub was one of 23 Americans. There was also several South Korean remains as well as some Vietnamese civilian remains in those two grave locations. So these are the teams, right, that had been established as part of the Paris Peace Accord to then work toward bringing closures to the families on both sides. And you can imagine there's a huge prisoner exchange, a lot of prisoners from North soldiers going back. Only 591 American prisoners came home in the initial batch, anyways, over several weeks. But those are the groups that led to then the JPAC and DPAA. Although not, very. There's a lot of connective tissue between the groups and agencies, all under the DoD. I've spoken with a lot of the people that have worked even then as well as now. I've spoken with several people who worked on the forensic teams and sites. And it's very important work. And they enlist the help of locals. And they can only do so many sites a year. In fact, I think it was last year, in a press release they put out, they had recovered the most ever in any single year. And it was in north of 200. And it's almost every day now on my Facebook page, I see updates from the various groups that another person has been, MIA has been identified, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any questions for Kevin from either Randy or Michael?
Yeah, I have a quick one. During the filming process, was there anything in particular that surprised you? Because it sounds like you came into the project with a considerable amount of knowledge about it, but I'm curious if there's anything that showed up that sort of caught you off guard and you learned something cool along the way, anything like that.
Well, actually, the list is long, but I'll share with you. And when we come back, I'll have the other two filmmakers with me, Michael and Shireen, co-producers on the group. After you do the screening or what have you, we'd love to come back and talk in more depth about that. But to answer your question specifically, there are two things. One is a quote from Stephen Grubb, the middle youngest son of the four Grubb brothers or sons. He said, for me, Vietnam was always the boogeyman, and I went to Vietnam, and it chased the boogeyman away. And I think when you watch some of the film, especially the part 2, the whole Grubbs visiting Vietnam and those that were responsible for shooting down and capturing their father, it's pretty powerful. But as a storyteller, early on, and I started taking notes about the human aspects of this, because I knew there was always going to be the X's and O's of war, and there's battles and there's wars and there's dates and there's events and tipping points, and I really didn't want to make that film. I wanted to make a film about family. And this is a film really about two families. And it's just a date is there, right, is the intersection point for the two of them. But, as I became more familiar with Vietnam, obviously 5 trips there over a year total time, and familiar with UFOM. And as Michael stated, this really started with UFOM coming here, trying to reach out to his brother who fought for the South. But what really drew me to the story is it really showed me, just how much we as humans who share this planet share. Yeah, we have all these outward differences. We have all these conflicts, but we share a lot. We love our families. We want health. We want to be loved. And we all want peace for the most part, right? And it's just so interesting as I got deeper into this and deeper into the Vietnamese side of this, because really it is an equal footing of both sides of these families through this story. I found myself thinking about, too often when those things we want, family and health and loved ones and peace, when they're taken from us, right, when they're torn from our hands, usually by people that have no thick relations, right, to us. They're making decisions militarily or politically, and in haste, and they're very distanced from the essence of what it means to go off and fight a foreign war, right? So they forget about the importance of the family unit, because it's the decisions that impact the family unit. And if you were to read Evelyn Grubb's petition to the United Nations, she uses that as her pivot, as her main the main essence of her petition, is because the United Nations, using their own words, states that the fabric of society is the family union. And Evelyn Grubb said, if the Vietnamese are not going to give information about my husband or my son's father, if you break that, tear that fabric, then I'm infringed upon, and you must react, take action. And that's
I love that. Thank
you. Really what, for me, I had to unpack over year. And when you watch the two families together and you think back about Van Grubb's, Stephen Grubb, his nickname is Van, comment about chasing the boogeyman away, it's right there. Because they put all that aside and they've found common ground to work. They have built bridges to work towards now common objectives, where at one point they were on opposite ends. So
Thank
that's
you so
really,
much.
Thanks for that
that's
question.
Very helpful for me.
Thank you.
Michael, anything?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing that story. That was absolutely, I agree with Brandy, that was so profound. Thank you. I guess my question would be just sort of, I guess it was sort of touched on at the end of the anecdote you were sharing a couple seconds ago, this healing process I have found to be so inspirational that, the children, like the whole analogy of Vietnam having been the boogeyman for them, but then they go there and that healing process. What was it like to be, what was it like to bear witness to that?
I'm a very emotional guy. It was tough to maintain the wall always. I'm an American first, and the Grubb family is American, and their family has made the ultimate sacrifice, and their mother went above and beyond and sacrificed her time raising her children to fight for her husband, the man she loved, and for the husbands of other wives. And I think that, it was tough. It was tough to hold back and to, but I had to, let me shift it off of me. The Grubb family is very brave for what they did. They're very brave, right? And I was lucky to have, as well as my co-producers and filmmakers, to have witnessed it. UFOM is brave as well, but for the family to do what they did, considering their circumstances, it's very brave. And I had to earn their trust for them to just jump on a plane with me. I'll say that as soon as we met UFOM, and maybe the next time, because there's some great anecdotal stories from Michael and how this even started. But I'll say that, and I'll speak for us as a group, we didn't just, as soon as we got this, run and say, I heard this guy over here said this guy about your father said this about it and knows more information. No, it was incumbent upon us to vet them, to vet the information, and feel confident and confirm and reconfirm information learned before reaching out. In fact, we didn't reach out to the family almost into the fourth year of even working on this, because we wanted to make sure that we had it right. We didn't want to play. I had already been to the league meetings. I knew, like I said before, it was on the surface. I knew how sensitive these subjects are for the families, and I didn't want to be the cause of pain. So I was willing to wait forever, or leave no stone unturned until we reached out to them and explained to them what we had been working on and the information that we wanted to share. So.
Thank you. And we're coming to the end of this discussion, but we will, as I said, be back with other conversations about this issue. And I want to just connect what Keyvn said, about Evelyn Grubb's speech about the impact to the family as this really fundamental unit of society and to the self. The United States Supreme Court has recognized the right of intimate association as constitutive to the notion of the self, and this idea is behind marriage equality and the rights of to adopt regardless of the sexual orientation of the parents and so forth, that there is this fundamental intimate right of association. And I just want to say, number one, in the United States, that's being linked to the self and to the concept of liberty, which are all service persons take an oath to. They take an oath to the Constitution. The other thing I wanted to remind us of with this idea about this family and these decisions about war impact the family, impact the self consequently, and as we have discussed her many times on this show, the individual who is most credited for bringing that to our consciousness is Bertha von Suttner, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize for her book Die Waffen nieder, originally published in German, Lay Down Your Arms. And it's a work of fiction that tells the story of how a war impacts a family. And she was the first person. This book was published in 1889. And she was really the first person to tell the human story of armed conflict. And Leo Tolstoy famously refers to Bertha as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of the peace movement, because Harriet Beecher Stowe, through her Uncle Tom's Cabin, humanized the slavery issue and really was a driving force behind the growth of the abolition movement in the United States. So this humanizing these stories, this is work that needs to be done, and it just Bertha was the first one to do this. Evelyn Grubb and the wives are doing this, and constantly reminding us of this human dimension, because it's that community, that wider community, that thick community of memory, which involves caring, does not really exist yet. I think we're in the process of making that. So, and that goes to your point, Keyvn, of widening the group that hears these stories, and thanks to your film, your film will help to do that. So it really, is just quite magical to connect with you and to have you be part of what we've been working on. We've been working on this project since, I call it 2019 BC, before COVID. So this has been something that we have been working on to bring this story to the community here, because it is such a powerful human story, and I think we're craving for stories like this. That will be the last thing that I say, but we'll just go around and we'll start with Michael, then Randy, and then Keyvn will have the last word. So, and if you don't want to say anything, just say thank you, and goodbye. But Michael, any final thoughts here?
I would really just echo your sentiment. I have been most fortunate. I just carry an immense sense of gratitude to have come to know this history and who have been a part of bringing this effort to life at Central Michigan University. As I had stated before, it has immersed itself into my being. It is a story that has resonated with me. Evelyn Grubb is an individual who I am most fortunate and most humbled to know her story, and this is something I will forever carry forward to anyone who is willing to listen, to anyone who finds it interesting, to anyone who has a care and passion about this duty to remember and the duty to know the past as so we can create a better future. So thank you to Kevin's work and to everyone else who has been a part of this effort.
And thank you, because Michael, you also, if I recall, you've shared the story with your own family.
Yes, I after the flag raising on the 18th, I went home for the weekend as part of I stagger my trips back home from here to southeastern Michigan to match up with haircuts. So it was my 5 weeks has been up, and it was time for me to head back. And so I had all the brochures and stuff, and I was going to be able to see some family members. Oh, and it was just a story I shared in earnest. I could just tell it had impacted me so deeply from just the sheer excitement and passion and this, this unyielding need to share with them, with my family members, this history. And I know they're all big fans of history, and they're well-read individuals, and so they really took it to heart as well. And even sharing it with other family members who lived through the Vietnam era. I know I've been in touch with my aunt who grew up in the 60s, and this was the POW cause, MIA cause was something at the forefront as being an anti-war protester during those times. And so this was a story she really took to heart as well. And same with my grandparents, who were both raised in the 50s. This was history that they had lived through. And so their faces when I was, telling them of my involvement in this was absolutely priceless. And you could just tell that it was something that resonated really, really profoundly with them. So I am most fortunate too.
And we are so fortunate to have you be part of this team. And Randy?
Well, one of the things that Kevin said really has stuck with me. He said that he was sort of taken aback by how all this sharing and coming together of a community emerged out of what began as horrific tragedy. And I'm really amazed at the idea that soldiers who gave the ultimate sacrifice and never made it home are still in some very serious way still serving, because they're providing this force in some way that I don't understand, that has this uniting activity at the tail end, where for one way or another somehow people are coming together in order to support the people who need it on this end. And so it's really doubling down on my appreciation for the men and women in uniform, and this idea of service is just really deepening for me as a result of this conversation. So I'm happy to be a part of it.
And we're happy to have you be a part of it too. And Kevin, you have the last word.
Well, thank you again for the comments and your reactions so positively. I'll just say that I'm really impressed with the effort out of your department, Hope, and on the larger part of Central Michigan University for the month-long series you guys have put together, and for doing the necessary work to make it right and to find more information and make it detailed and respectful as it should be. I was really impressed with the photography and the videos that I watched at your Facebook page, and the text that you guys have pulled together for your websites and everything. So, if we could just get another 10 or so dozen universities to do the same. I think we could broaden the reach here, because it really is still an awareness campaign on behalf of Evelyn Grubb and the League of Families. And Evelyn Grubb was the face for a couple of years of the organization as national coordinator, but there's just so many women involved, and men as well. But we could talk more about that another time. But happy to talk about more of the production aspects of the film, with the film members, our team, as well as what led us to this. Because there's a whole other side of this of this journey coming from Ufam and his family's own struggle to reconcile after peace was ripped from their hands in '54, or maybe even in '46 or 1946, '54. When they were mired in the first big war. So, anyways. Again, thank you for having me. It's been a joy, and I'm really happy that you guys are championing some of these subjects here. I'm really tickled by it.
Likewise. So you have been listening to Virtues of Peace. Please check out the resources on our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. Kevin did mention this month-long series of events. And the series ends on October 1st. We may be continuing these conversations after that, but I just want to say that date of October 1st is linked to the public announcement of the identification of Private First Class John Shalemba of Hamtramck, Michigan. He was identified last year by the DPAA. There's a little bit about him on our website, dutytoremember.com, and we hope to be talking more about him in the shows to come. Thank you, everyone. It has been a delight, and God bless. And thank you so much for your work, Kevin, and helping to transmit these extremely important stories.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yeah, bye-bye.